broadcast booth is a more complex place than most of us tend to think. There are personalities involved. There's an information flow from the control room. The producer is always entitled to talk to you. The director is entitled to talk to you sometimes too. You're processing all of that as you go through an increasingly complex informational process, with statistical formulas having gotten more and more and more involved and informative, valuable, that it's a far more challenging technical craft, I believe, now than it was back when I was doing it. However, there's also a perspective from which to say, no, Jim, it's exactly the opposite. It is an easier technical craft now because of all the information they have to process. And it was harder when you were doing it because you had to do more to buttress a narrative verbally. Take your pick. Either way, it's a complex craft.
Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Before we delve into your new book, we have a bit of a tradition on our show. We delve into basketball culture. So take this any way you want it. What is your first or favorite basketball memory?
I was 8 years old in 1957, living in the little mountain town of Hendersonville, North Carolina. And my father died when I was 5 years old. My mother was endeavoring to expose me to every sports event that she knew he would have watched. So I got to stay up till midnight for the very first time, the night that the University of North Carolina Tar Heels beat the Kansas Jayhawks in triple overtime to win the national championship with an unbeaten season of 32-0. And the whole experience was family intoxicating, sports intoxicating, memory intoxicating, and it made a deep imprint on me. It wasn't very long after that. I was maybe 9 years old when I made a firm decision I was going to go to the University of North Carolina. But at the end of the day, that first basketball experience was unforgettable, and we're far enough beyond it now that there may not be a lot of people who remember. That team went 32-0. They were triple overtime in the final of the Atlantic Coast Conference basketball tournament against Wake Forest. They were triple overtime with Michigan State in the national semifinal. They were triple overtime with Kansas in the final and won all those games.
Now, that's incredible. And kind of linking into that, you have such a knowledge base of just everything that you've experienced just in terms of your broadcast history. So with this book that you have written with art, can you kind of take us into the creative process of narrowing this down just in terms of what made the book, what didn't, just the creative process? Was that it was an easy or hard situation just putting this all together? Because you're just a legend in this industry. And I'm just curious, just in terms of compiling just everything that you have experienced, just how was that in terms of finally putting the final project together?
Well, I very specifically declined within my own dialogue of myself and approach to the book. I declined that I would make a firm beginning outline and specify in advance in extreme detail what it was I was going to write, rather than to do what amounts to a memoir from my own consciousness, from my own memories. And for a variety of reasons, I elected to do the latter. So I strove for something that was legitimately a personal statement about the uniqueness of my experience, the bizarre connections of luck and circumstance, and familial background, and all sorts of things that ultimately led to this long career with a lot of different kinds of exposures, with a lot of enviable outcomes and no shortage of unenviable outcomes. And it, if I kept my eyes open that whole time as to what was going on with me, then I had a chance to write something that might be interesting about where sports television began when I stepped into a network in 1974 and where it was when I left that world in 2018.
Jim, I'd be curious again, drawing from your wide experience and the number of sports that you've covered and broadcasted. Um, what sets basketball apart, and maybe what are some of the unique challenges with making a good basketball broadcast?
Well, um, the Carolina basketball team that I saw and first fell in love with in 1957 was arguably a great team with personnel, but it was the coach's specific chemistry and his ability to command what he wanted from his players that ultimately allowed them to go 32 and 0. And of course, one of his assistants was a guy named Dean Smith. And when I was at the University of North Carolina and in my first year of graduate school in the radio, television, motion pictures department, after an undergraduate degree in English, I began working at and doing things that had some tangential relationships to the basketball program, and eventually wound up doing some of the Dean Smith radio program on the local radio station, pregame and postgame shows on the UNC basketball network, all during the Dean Smith era, and developed that currency with the sport that made me believe I would surely be, once I moved into network television, a future basketball play-by-play man. And I actually had something in the way of audition type or introduction to the rotation type experiences with both ABC and CBS, and never broke through to the go on forward toward the program schedule on a regular basis. So I have to believe that I, despite my love and passion for the sport, was not a particularly great basketball play-by-play announcer. It happens. I mean, if you had told me very early on, or even into the middle of my career, if you had said, your ultimate destiny is as a boxing announcer, the way you will be remembered is as a boxing blow-by-blow person, your ultimate identity, despite your exposure at 3 commercial networks, is going to come from your association with a premium pay cable network, etc. If you'd told me all those things, I'd have said, no possible way. I'm the guy who had an office in the ABC building when I was 25, 26 years old, because it was so clear where ultimately I was going to go. But no, life doesn't work out the way you expect it to.
Now, that's incredible. And with that experience, I'm interested to get your opinion on, just since you have just you're so closely associated with the world of boxing. Can you kind of compare that in terms of just the emotional stories in that sport compared to a team sport like basketball? Because I am a huge combat sports fan, and I have to admit I love basketball, but there's something with boxing in particularly that I'm just more engaged just because of the stories and what the combatants are doing in that ring. It just feels like there's more on the line compared to a team sport where there's always tomorrow. You're scoring a point, you're not putting your livelihood or your life on the line, but just the sport of boxing, it just brings a lot more emotion, and you're able to capture that just through your calling, just your multitude of fights. So you kind of compare that dichotomy just in terms of just that there's just a different emotion that I think the fan has. I'm sure you have just calling those fights compared to traditional team sports.
Go. I don't think I can say it any better than you just did. Boxing is the most personal, most intimate, most from the heart and from the central core sport. Victory or defeat will tell you more about a man as a fully constituted human being than in any other sport, where some form of technical artifice, whether it's a racket or a club or whatever it is, creates a necessary technique that makes it more technical. Boxing is the oldest and most primal of competitive instincts, 2 guys standing in front of each other and trying to erase, either tactically or powerfully, the other guy. So I think that it's inevitable that over time, competitive margins get smaller and smaller, and boxers learn more and more ways to beat each other. And even though a guy may be undefeated through 72 fights, doesn't mean that there isn't someone out there with a formula to beat him. There probably is. He just hasn't run into that guy quite yet. Mike Tyson had no idea that Buster Douglas was going to be his kryptonite. And so on and so forth throughout the history of the sport.
Jim, I believe you said in one of your broadcasts that there's no athletes like fighters. And can you elaborate on that idea? I mean, certainly an obvious difference is the element of pain. Not that there's not pain in other sports, but obviously with boxing or other combat sports, it's different. I mean, that's the goal. You're going to inflict some pain, and you're going to be tested enduring that pain as well. What is it about fighters, and in addition to that element, that makes them so unique?
Well, first of all, with regard to pain, we're tempted to think of pain as a physical condition, but in a lot of ways, it's also a psychological condition, whether for short duration or long duration. So, fighting through pain and continuing to recognize and understand that whatever pain you felt on that last landed punch in your rib cage, you're going to feel that 50 more times from here to the finish of the fight, and the will that it takes to continue to go through that. All those things are among the multi-dimensional person-to-person human confrontation element that make all one-on-one sports intriguing. And some people like the martial arts type combat. I just happen to be a boxing guy because the first thing that my mother ever sat me down to watch at age 6 in the world of combat sports was Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship of the world in 1955. My mother sat me in front of a small television on a TV dinner tray at a Christmas party in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and said, "Watch this, sit right here. This is Gillette Friday Night Fights. In the next 90 minutes, a man named Don Dunphy is going to teach you everything you need to know about boxing. And oh, by the way, this is Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship. It's their second fight. And Sugar Ray Robinson is my favorite fighter because he dances while he fights." And then she went back upstairs to the party, and I sat there alone and watched that fight and fell in love with the whole ethos of the telecast, the way that Dunphy called the fights, the informational base that he was already using, which became ultimately the germination of what we tried to broaden and perfect on HBO in terms of storytelling. And yeah, it was an instant intoxication. And then very shortly after that, and that was in Hendersonville, North Carolina, my mother moved to Miami, Florida to learn how to sell life insurance to keep body and soul together. And I read in the Miami Herald and the Miami News that if Cassius Clay fought Sonny Liston, it was likely that that fight would take place at the Miami Beach Convention Center. So that led to a long series of weeks and months of lawn mowing and car washing to collect enough money to go to February 25, 1964, Miami Beach Convention Center, my hero, Cassius Clay, against Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world. So that was the first live prize fight I ever saw after having watched a whole lot of Friday night fights on Gillette.
I want to shift gears a little bit. And in the chapter, New York Calling, you discuss how Slovenia was home of ski flying. And, now it's more associated with Luka Doncic. And I just want to get your opinion on just the international growth of basketball, especially within the NBA, along with Luka. There's Victor Wembanyama. There's countless other players that are dominating the game of basketball, probably a lot more than Americans are. I'm just curious, just throughout your experience, if you had ever thought that, the MVP of the NBA, probably the top 4 or 5 contenders would not be from America. And it'd be such a dominated game that is now infiltrated by a lot of international players. I'm just curious of your opinion on that.
Well, consider that my evolution as a fan goes from the, of course, all white, 4 Catholics and a Jew starting five of North Carolina in 1957 through my freshman year at UNC with Charlie Scott as a classmate, the first Black player at the University of North Carolina, through having friends from Chapel Hill and contacts from Chapel Hill who went on to play in the NBA, like James Worthy, like Charlie Scott, like Bob McAdoo, like various contemporaries, Mitch Kupchak, Tom Lagarde, et cetera, et cetera. So all through that period of time, I was not just from Carolina, but eventually from other sources. And then in 1974, I was hired by ABC Sports to be the first person who stood on the sidelines of college football with a camera and a microphone. And that became the platform for all sorts of other opportunities, including my failed stints as a basketball play-by-play broadcaster.
I'm curious also, Jim, on the court, what you've observed since that time and how the game has evolved. Obviously now, like one of the main continuing narratives is that the 3-point shot is paramount. And obviously the game, yes, has spread out to the perimeter quite a bit more than even when I was falling in love with the sport of basketball. Has it surprised you to see where the game has evolved?
A little. But as I've grown older, I've become more adept at understanding and recognizing the degree to which in all sports, craft is king. It's a principle in boxing that we're taught not to forget, that ultimately, the guy who looks like the more physically imposing fighter might not be the guy who has better craft and more understanding of what he's doing. And I think we've seen the evolution of that in professional basketball in particular, but in all basketball globally, not just in the United States, but in all other cultures. So that what you saw back in the 60s and into the 70s, when I was passionate and watching, et cetera, was often dominated by physical differences, the enormous physical capabilities of players who were evolving during that era. Now it's far more likely to be dictated by technical craft and execution of technical craft, because there are a lot of athletes out there. There are a lot of people who've seen those Michael Jordan films and figured out how to condition and work and try to commit at that level, but they don't all have the understanding of how to play.
I want to get your opinion, Jim, on just modern sports media overall, just in terms of this everything going to more of a streaming model and specifically just commentary. I just know personally for myself, I'm just in a minority. I'm really drawn to play-by-play broadcasters, and just there's a relationship between the viewer and the color and play-by-play person, and especially myself watching so many fights on HBO, yourself and just Max Kellerman and Roy Jones. Like there's just countless moments there. I feel like now, not only with streaming, but with social media, that relationship is lost just because everything is just spliced up in just a 30-second and 60 seconds clips. I'm curious as your opinion of just the relationship between the commentators and the fan at home. Do you think that's been compromised just due to technology, or do you think it's still there? It's just in a different way, just in terms of how the fan at home gets that information from broadcasters like yourself and your colleagues nowadays?
So you have to understand that when I first began to completely immerse myself in sports television, it's Chris Schenkel at ABC, it's Kurt Gowdy at NBC, it's ultimately Pat Summerall and some others at CBS. These are historic, iconic, brilliantly talented names, and they all made deep and lasting imprints on the craft, so that I can look at the very best sportscasters now, whether we're talking about cable, whatever remains of premium pay cable, streaming, Zoom, podcasts, whatever it is. I can look at everybody and see in some way, shape, or form a smidgen of the guys whom I watched when I was growing up, whom I competed with during my career from 1974 to 2018 and who have come along now in the 6, 7, 8 years since that time. And it's a constantly evolving craft. It's a thrilling and challenging craft. You don't have to worry about the global political implications of anything you say. You're talking about sports by and large. And I could not feel more gifted by life than to have had the experience that I had, and happy and proud for all the other men and women who've had the same gift.
Jim, I'm wondering what you feel social media has done. I mean, adding that element, there's more closeness with athletes in some ways than there has been before, depending on the athlete that you're looking at. Do you feel like social media has been an enhancement to the fan experience from just what you've seen and maybe observed from those around you?
Well, maybe an enhancement for the fan experience, yes, in the sense that introducing fantasy into what once was a reality-based discussion in some way enlivens the atmosphere and makes it even more interesting. I'm not a subscriber to that. I'm an old-fashioned truth devotee, and so it's difficult for me to place the concepts of social media and positive into the same sentence, maybe even into the same paragraph, but that's just me.
Jim, just from this book, what do you want readers to take away when completing it?
I think what I would want readers to take away is the complexity and multi-level challenges, particularly during my temporal arc, 1974 to 2018, in the sports television world, and the challenges that that environment and atmosphere placed on all of us who were working on the air and doing that kind of work. Because I think there's an all too convenient and available to me, available to anybody, to sit at home on the sofa, listen to the smooth, often sophisticated and urbane commentary delivered on the air by people of impeccable craft, and not realize how hard it is to do that, how much work goes into it, how the research resources are so critical to that outcome, how complex it truly is to do the best possible job in that world. And I'm just grateful that I got a chance to see all that from the inside for 44 years, so that when I watch a show, I have at least a theoretical base from which to judge, appreciate, enjoy, point out what's going on.
Do you think technology has made it easier? And with the evolution of technology, do you think that poses some interesting challenges for broadcasters now because there's AI? Things can be easily, you mentioned just in terms of facts. I mean, with technology and artificial intelligence, AI gets things wrong. I mean, it's not reliable. And do you think with just your future broadcasters out there, instead of doing traditional research, relying on, AI, a shortcut to maybe get the research done a little bit faster, do you think that's a disservice to the viewer at home when there's the finished product, whatever sport they're watching?
You're talking about several different elements that can figure into a chemical mix of factors that are going on within the personality interplay and the technical craft of doing a broadcast. Broadcast booth is a more complex place than most of us tend to think. There are personalities involved. There's an information flow from the control room. The producer is always entitled to talk to you. The director is entitled to talk to you sometimes too. You're processing all of that as you go through an increasingly complex informational process, with statistical formulas having gotten more and more and more involved and informative, valuable, that it's a far more challenging technical craft, I believe, now than it was back when I was doing it. However, there's also a perspective from which to say, no, Jim, it's exactly the opposite. It was It is an easier technical craft now because of all the information they have to process. And it was harder when you were doing it because you had to do more to buttress a narrative verbally. Take your pick. Either way, it's a complex craft. And I think a lot of people to this day don't appreciate and understand that, because the television shows that have been done about sportscasting were usually of a comic base.
Jim, one of the common narratives that I see between both boxing and basketball is this talk about greatness and the greatest of all time. And sometimes this conversation can get a little bit silly, the GOAT debates and things like that. I'm wondering if in the time you have covered both of these sports, you have noticed similarities in this conversation of greatness between basketball and boxing. Granted, we've already mentioned, I mean, the great differences between the sports, obviously one being team, one individual. Are there common elements that you kind of notice when you've discussed greatness or seen others discuss greatness in both sports?
And of politics, of business, of music, of virtually any walk of life in which people's accomplishments and stature are compared to one another. Yes, absolutely. And it always becomes increasingly more complex. And you learn over time. And I say over time, you don't know it at the beginning, but you understand over time how important it is to process all of that out and channel forward, focusing almost entirely on the content of the work that you do. Anything else is a distraction. It took me a long time to really get my head around that, particularly given that I, early on in my network television career, moved from Chapel Hill, North Carolina to Manhattan in the late 1970s, at the pretty much the ultra height of the three network hegemony. And in that world where everybody interacted within a 4-block area of each other on 6th Avenue, we all went to the same places for lunch. We all got our haircut at the same places. It was a very small and extremely thrill-centric world. So I don't know if anybody can feel that way now in the multi-channel, multi-directional media world where there are so many messages crossing and intersecting at the same time. I think it's a completely different kind of public craft now than back when I was doing what I was doing.
Jim, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Really appreciate it. Can you let our audience know if you have any other projects you're working on, where they can find what you're up to nowadays, and anything else you want our audience to be aware of?
Title of my autobiography is It Happened, and it publishes on April 15th. Ben Bella Books. And you can buy it now on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So that's my closing message. Thanks very much. It was great to be with you guys.
Likewise. Thank you very much. Truly appreciate it.